What do legendary guitar players like John Mayer, Carlos Santana, Robin Ford, Stevie Ray Vaughan, Larry Carlton, Joe Bonamassa, and Eric Clapton have in common? Apart from being guitar gods, obviously, well, they all use or have used Dumble amps. But what exactly is a Dumble amp? To many, it is a scam, but to other players is the holy grail of sound. So much so that nowadays an original unit might go for over $100,000 on Reverb. But where does all this hype come from? Let's start from the beginning. Howard Dumble was born in California in 1944, and from an early age, he showed a fascination with electronics and music. As a young man, he began experimenting with guitar amplifiers, trying to find a way to create the perfect sound. Dumble's pursuit of tonal excellence led him to create a series of amplifiers that would become legendary. The first Dumble amplifier was built in the early 1960s, and it surely showed signs of having a character of its own. It was a heavily modified Fender Blackface, and although later on his work gained popularity for this kind of sound, with roots in Fender circuits, Howard progressed his amp craft through the 70s by building and modifying high-gain amps such as Randalls and Mesa Boogies. The unique sound of Dumble's units quickly caught the attention of guitar players, and soon the amps were in high demand. Despite their popularity, Howard Dumble remained an elusive figure, shunning the spotlight and allowing the amplifiers to speak for themselves. This mystique only added to the allure of the Dumble amplifiers, and they became sought after by guitar players around the world. The thing is, Howard decided never to scale his operation, and everything was designed and built by hand. He even put together his own speaker cabinets, something that's more carpentry work than electronic engineering. But his attention to detail was everything. It is said that no two Dumble amps are the same, even if they share matching model names and components. This is because the amp wizard calibrated and voiced each unit taking into consideration the owner's play style. To achieve this, it was not uncommon that players had to meet him at his workshop and play for him several times during the construction process of the amp, which was not a brief affair.
So let's take a look at my amplifier now. I use a Dumble Overdrive Special amplifier. It's a custom-built tube amplifier that's best sounding amplifier I've ever heard. Really beautiful sound, get a very wide variety of sounds, and I'm lucky to have with me today my good friend Mr. Alexander Dumble, who built this amplifier. Dr. D, could you explain to me just why do tubes sound different than transistors? What's the difference?
Well, the difference comes down to this. The more fragile harmonics can survive in a vacuum tube where they seem to be eliminated or squashed in a solid-state crystal lattice. It just comes down to that. The physics of it, electrons can survive in a free space vacuum where they have trouble in a crystal lattice. I think that's the best and simplest I can put it.
Such a boutique approach to amp making clearly resulted in the overall manufacturing taking months, if not years. It would not sound strange, now that I mentioned this, that there are only about 300 Dumble amps out there. Scarcity is the food of legends, especially in the music industry, but it's not a sufficient condition for success. You see, if those 300 or so amps were nothing special, we wouldn't be talking about them. But at this point you might be thinking, if guitar amps are just off-the-shelf electronics arranged in a particular way, why not just take a look into one of Howard's creations, copy them exactly, and make a profit? Well, it's not that simple. To begin with, as I said, every amp that left the shop is different from the others. You could copy the circuit of the one you are looking at, but the magic of Dumble's was that they would fit the player as a glove, a custom-made glove. The most critical issue, however, is that Mr. Dumble, just like many other geniuses, was very zealous of his work and didn't want any greasy-fingered electronic engineer just copying his homework. Enter the black goop. It's reported that a lot of Dumble amps had their circuitry covered in a black goop substance that made their designs pretty hard to copy. Also, there are reports of these amps being built with electronic components that had been stored for quite some time, which sometimes resulted in them performing at different values than what they are labeled for. A novice builder would just purchase the parts just by looking at their face values rather than measuring their performance to determine their actual properties. And any other sane person would be driven crazy if they had to check every component of the amp one by one to make a diagram. Of course, there's a workaround for everything, and this was not a definitive way of keeping copycats away. However, if you were the owner of such an amp, after all the weight and what you paid for it, because Dumble amps were cheaper back then when compared with their actual prices, but by no means they were cheap. You wouldn't risk damaging it just to let a friend take a look under the hood. And of course, if you later needed to send the unit back to the workshop, and the man himself discovered you were tampering with his design, you would probably be cut off from his close friends list. There are stories of Dumble amps being snatched from a musician's tour bus at night, after a show, studied overnight by an engineer as if they were alien technology, and brought back the next morning for the tour to continue. None of this has been actually confirmed as far as I know, but it lives in the folklore that's shared among enthusiasts, and of course fuels the legend. Eventually, and especially since the internet became a thing, the designs of these machines became slightly more accessible. People started sharing what they knew in online forums, and more builders began trying to clone one of these beasts. But as I mentioned countless times now, there can't be such a thing as a Dumble clone for a specific model since every unit is unique. This is why replicas are just interpretations of the overall concept of these amps, with pretty similar circuits and components, but ultimately tuned to the particular builder's preference. And that preferences are, at length, formed based on their experience and knowledge of the myth. Now, if all of this just sounds like too much hassle for just a guitar amp, let me present you with a thought experiment. What would have happened if Jim Marshall only built 300 amps? Crazy to think, huh? Wouldn't those few units be sold for hundreds or thousands or even millions of dollars? Well, probably. Especially with how mainstream the brand became and how many guitar legends can be seen still nowadays rocking vintage Marshalls. The truth is, we could never tell what that reality would look like. But Dumbles, without a strong brand like Marshall, now can go for over $100,000. And what's funny about Dumble amps that enter the market every now and then is that their previous owners influence the price a lot. Not long ago, there was a unit for sale that was once Keith Urban's and later John Mayer's. But really, these prices are only those that are made public. It's very hard to imagine what something like this might go for on a private transaction, especially between millionaire gearheads, which are the main public of these amps. Howard Dumble passed away on January 16, 2022, and with him probably went a lot of trade secrets that will never be brought back. His vision deeply influenced the sound of guitar amps, and particularly of the music we listen to since, at least, the 80s. This was probably not the first boutique amp operation ever, but one can argue that probably it was the boutique-est. Commonly, guitar players work very close with guitar manufacturers, builders, or luthiers when a tailor-made instrument is being made for them. From the tone woods chosen to the electric components to the shape of the body and paint, but especially the shape of the neck, size of the frets, and feel of the whole thing are subject to many reviews and iterations. And that's natural, because a professional musician might spend countless hours a year perfecting and performing their craft with that instrument. But this wasn't that much the norm with guitar amps. Not until Dumble. In general, and although very influential on sound, amps were always more of a commodity. Many musicians don't even tour with an amp, because they are heavy, fragile, and pretty hard to transport. Before digital pedal boards, guitarists would just rent out what is called a backline from a music store or gear rental in the city they were playing in. A Marshall JCM 800 is a Marshall JCM 800 in Nashville, the same as it is in Seattle. But Dumbles are not. As the man took a luthier approach to his work, his amps became just as important, and I might argue that later, more important than the actual instrument. Nowadays, things have changed a bit, and even when probably the majority of us would never be able to play through an actual Dumble, there are options out there. First of all, there are the clones. A lot of great amp makers such as Fuchs or Two Rock have been progressing on Howard's platform for years. The thing is, even these are still very expensive amps. Any decent Dumble clone will cost you probably over $3,000. But are they worth it? That's up to you to decide. Sadly, these are off-the-shelf units, and the interviewing and tuning to your playing part is lost. However, if you just want to sound like John Mayer, or the interpretation of his Dumble amp sound a particular builder has, you could easily go buy an amplified Nation Wonderland overdrive online. I have linked an article in the description below where I discuss some of my favorite clones in the market. You should check it out if you are interested in learning more about them. Now, if you are on a budget, there are amp-in-a-box solutions that might come for a fraction of the cost of a full-blown amp. This trend probably started with Hermida Drive's Zen Drive, but these days the options are endless and out of the scope of this video. Finally, as another alternative for getting a feel of what these amps might sound like, there are many digital pedal boards that have amp models quite resembling Dumbles. For instance, the Line 6 Helix has the Litigator amp, which is stated to not be based on anything, but most players agree is very close to a Dumble. Whether such an amp is right for you or not, really only you can tell. The common consensus among players is that although the secret weapon tone of a Dumble can be emulated with a series of pedals and other amps, reverse engineering takes a lot of steps and knowledge, while the original amps only took a guitar and a cable. Sometimes, with these things, players pay a premium not only for excellence, but also for simplicity. Gear that just works and sounds good any way it's set up is the gold standard for a lot of musicians. There's also the argument that all of this is just for the player, and that the audience wouldn't ever be able to tell if Robben Ford was playing through a rented Fender Deluxe Reverb or his legendary Dumble. And while that's probably true, what I have to say to that is that perhaps Mr. Ford wouldn't be as inspired or effective in his playing with what another amp gives him back when he is performing. We will never know.